Hello everyone and welcome back to Gwent. This is an episode of my new show, Weekly Spice, where essentially it's my outlet for playing those few games that I don't intend at the moment to do long-term shows on or commit to in any serious way, but I might do just a couple of episodes every so often just to either catch up with it or kind of just talk about it because it's interesting in some way. But yeah, this episode, it is going to be Gwent, which is the card game that originally was a minigame within the Witcher 3 game, and which was loved so much by so many people, apparently, that it was decided that it would be transferred into its very own CCG, which, can you really blame CD Projekt Red for doing so, given how popular, say, Hearthstone has got, and essentially all the competition that has just sprung up out of nowhere? You know, Shadowverse, Elder Scrolls Legends, Duelist, Faria, all of those other similar CCGs that bring their own thing to the table simply because Hearthstone was so big and successful as a prospect. And so we see Gwent. Gwent being a very cool game in many ways because I have covered it on this channel before, and if you actually want a complete breakdown of what sets Gwent apart, I will hopefully at this very timestamp right here include a link and a pop-up to my Gwent What Is It video, which is essentially me outlining what Gwent actually was, and hopefully I'll also stick in the playlist of my previous videos on Gwent, and they should give you a decent idea of what the main gameplay mechanics are and what you are trying to do. Without that, this video might be a little abstract to understand if this is your first experience with Gwent, but I'll try and break it down from the gameplay that we see on screen. This is not live gameplay, as Gwent is very cognizantly focused. Is that even a proper grammatically accurate sentence? I do believe it is not, but it's a very much a thinking man's game. Instead of cards interacting with each other directly on a battlefield, such as in Hearthstone, where cards have, typically, if it's a minion, they have health and attack as two separate stats. In Gwent, the aim of the game is instead best of 3 rounds, and each round, whoever has the most overall power, overall strength, as signified by the big numbers essentially on the left of the screen, and the blue flag and the red flag there, above and below the coin that you see flipping around between each player's turn. Whoever has the most strength at the end of a round wins. And since it's a best of 3, whoever wins 2 rounds first wins the game. So it's really simplified in that sense. Board to board kind of minion to minion interaction is typically reduced in Gwent compared to, say, Hearthstone. Hearthstone, by the way, it will be my main source of comparison here, simply because it is, I think we can safely say, the market leader in the CCG, the online CCG genre, that has recently sprung up. So, yeah, it's different in that sense, but this is counteracted by the fact that this is a game much more focused on balancing resources and having a game plan. So if you notice that you are outcarding your opponent, so if you look at so you can see the leader portraits to the left of all the cards, and then to the left of that there's 2 cards kind of in a fan and a number below and above that. So my opponent, you'll be able to see, has 9 cards in his hand, and I currently have 8. Although I do believe it is my opponent's turn, so essentially we're on equal resources at the moment. And it does, yes, count your leader card as a card in that count. So if, say, you found yourself on 7 cards and your opponent had instead 5, you could legitimately pass around, if you were ahead on board in terms of overall strength, that being how you win the round, you could legitimately choose to pass that round, as long as you could afford to, you know, you hadn't lost one already, and force your opponent to play more cards and further lose card advantage, thus giving you a really powerful, you know, final round. And this kind of resource-based strategy where you're trying to think how will you kind of gain advantage in terms of cards over your opponent, what's your most efficient, you know, use of cards, what's your best strategy in terms of that sense. So as you can see on screen, I'm actually about to give a unit on my side of the board the resilience, or the, I think it might be actually called resilient keyword, which means that a card actually stays around at the end of a particular round. So otherwise, cards just disappear and the board is wiped and you restart. Since it is a best of 3, that makes the most sense. But resilient creatures can stick around, and that essentially gives you a really big kind of bonus going through multiple rounds. They only stick around for 1 extra round, so if you have a resilient creature in round 1 and you lose round 2, they won't be there in round 3. But even so, it's another kind of way of reinforcing the main focus of this game being who has the most sort of value and card advantage and resources to play with. So it's a really cool game. Hopefully that sort of gave you a bit of an understanding as to what is happening on screen. Essentially, we're both kind of competing with each other and attempting to get the most overall strength at the end of each round in order to ultimately win the game. And as you can see here, we're actually both still in this very drawn out, very slugfest-like first round of this game. Fortunately, I have played a special card, which is, the special cards are essentially spell cards in this game, and it was a weather card, and so this gave all rows on my opponent's side, there being separate rows for certain units, all of those rows a weather condition. And this weather condition does, I do believe, 2 damage to the weakest unit on each of those rows. So potentially, if the opponent, say in the best case scenario, had a unit on each of their rows that could be hit by this weather effect, he would be taking 6 strength damage every turn, which is huge. Even though that is not happening, I'm still getting 3 damage every turn, so I'm definitely, as you can see, 31 strength on my side compared to my opponent's 11 strength, and I actually am on par with him card advantage-wise, 5 cards to 5. I have used my leader ability, but he's also 1 card less, so we're completely even, and I've got 20 strength over him, so this is basically going as well as I could hope. But yeah, Gwent, so that's a bit of an introduction to start off with. What's happened with it since I last covered it? Since the last time I actually played Gwent was back in closed beta, and naturally closed beta being, as you would expect, a time of tumultuous change, and the opponent forfeits, by the way. Feels good, man. Closed beta being closed beta, a lot has changed since then. What previously existed in Gwent was, in fact, faction-wide passive abilities that sort of helped define and add an extra bit of character overall to certain factions. So, the Scoia'tael, for example, could pick a round out of those 3 rounds in a game. They could pick a round to choose to either go first, or let their opponent go first, or let the dice decide, to essentially waver their choice until potentially the next round. This allowed them to do really cool things involving who had card advantage at a specific point. Skellige, as well, also had the faction-wide passive of, at the starts of round 2 and 3, you previously, all of your bronze cards, I believe, actually gained 1 extra strength. So in rounds 2, there would be Skellige players would be stronger than in round 1, and in round 3, Skellige players, again, would be stronger than in rounds 2 and 1. So yeah, these faction-wide passives have now gone, and instead, they have been converted into keywords that more or less have been applied to only that faction's units, only that faction's cards. And what does that mean? Well, it means that whilst overall factions have lost a bit of flavour that they once had, which is, you know, kind of sad, because I'm a huge kind of proponent of the idea of factions being super unique and interesting in that sense, and, you know, it allows a bit more role-playing, which is also always nice. But what that allows instead is a tighter and more focused control over the power level of certain cards and certain mechanics, as, say, the Skellige faction passive, as I just described, that's been condensed instead now into the keyword Veteran. And this Veteran keyword can be given to some bronze cards and not given to others to balance them. So it's definitely long-term going to be very advantageous in terms of balance. So I imagine that's why they did it. And it also, to some extent, simplifies the game, as you don't have to think about, well, what can this faction do compared to this other faction? But not too much, as the abilities still exist as a mechanic within the game. It's just that certain cards have them and certain cards don't. And what this has meant, actually, that some cards have a lot of text to read through compared to what they previously had, because they've got all these extra keywords tied in. So short-term, Gwent, for new players, will be immediately confusing for the first sort of few days of playing, but long-term, the game balance and sort of the overall health of the game, I do believe, will be much improved. So yeah, that's one thing that has definitely changed. And another thing that's changed is that they've added just a lot more content to the game. They've added a bunch of challenges to the game that allow you to, once you've beaten 3 challenges, and there's, I think it's actually for all races and all races, all factions and all faction leaders, you can, once you've completed 3 challenges, unlock a faction leader. So previously, the only way of accessing these in the closed beta was just crafting them. They were treated as a card, and that's still the case to some extent. If you want the, you know, the shiny premium cards in Gwent, you will definitely have to craft and spend your hard-earned meteorite ore, which is also a new resource that is specifically used for premium shiny cards. You will still have to craft those shiny leader cards, but if you don't really care about that, which I think, you know, 90% of the player base don't really, since we can't afford to, you can instead just complete all of the individual faction challenges and unlock all of the leaders to play with, which is super cool. It's a way to, first off, it adds an alternate way to play Gwent and introduce yourself to the mechanics of each faction, which is very nice. It allows you to settle in as a new player and get used to it, which in CCGs being often quite complex immediately as you dive in, that's definitely appreciated. After all, that is why Hearthstone does adventures, or at least used to. But yeah, regardless. And also it makes the whole focus on essentially pay to win, which is what CCGs are, that is just the genre that they exist in. You pay for card packs, or kegs, as they are called in Gwent. More often known as card packs in Hearthstone and Pokemon, you know, etc, etc. But you pay for those cards and you have a chance of getting good cards and a chance of getting bad cards. Individual card packs or kegs will have varying values between them based on the random nature of what cards you end up getting from them. So having these leader cards available to unlock through another method that doesn't require investing money into it, or just time playing and harvesting all the resources you get from wins and stuff. That's definitely a great idea, and I think a lot of people trying to get into Gwent will appreciate that if they don't intend to sink, you know, boatloads of cash into just getting, you know, 60 plus kegs from the get-go. Fortunately, I did actually get a whole bunch of kegs as a result of simply leveling up my character in closed beta, so I've actually got a decent boost. And originally this video was going to be just one massive keg opening session, but it ended up being, I actually rendered it and it was around 1 hour 15 minutes, and 1 hour 15 minutes, despite it giving me a good opportunity to explain a lot of the new keywords, I figured, you know what, I don't think most people will want to watch this, so instead you've got gameplay, so hopefully this is more entertaining. But yeah, regardless, my collection is sort of in a better spot than I anticipated, given that I had spent a bunch of time in closed beta, which is nice. But for those people who hadn't spent time in closed beta, for those people, for the new players getting into the open beta for the first time, just getting to grips with Gwent, the ability to unlock certain cards through challenges, that's fantastic. The genre is known for being expensive, and rare are the people who can afford to play multiple CCGs at any one time because of that inherent cost with the genre. And so, yeah, that's pretty fantastic. More CCGs need to, you know, just lower the initial price point barrier inherent to the genre. It's just a really good idea, and I think a lot of people appreciate it. So, what else has changed that I've noticed? Well, one thing, actually. Weather has changed massively. So previously in closed beta, weather was a lot more immediately powerful. Where, I think unanimously each weather effect would... Well, first off, each weather effect would hit a specific row. So Frost would hit the melee row, Fog would hit the ranged row, and Rain, Torrential Rain, would hit the siege row, I think it was. And they'd all have exactly the same effect of essentially nerfing all of those units that were hit by weather, aka all non-gold units, on that row down to 1 strength, thus exposing them to future damage sources that can just instantly wipe them out. But that's hugely swingy and hugely powerful, so I'm actually not too surprised that they decided to fundamentally change weather in how it worked. So now, each weather effect, Frost, Fog, and Rain, has a individual and unique effect, I guess I would call it. So Frost, I believe, hits the weakest unit on a row and does damage to it, I think 2 damage. Rain hits the... I think Rain hits all the units on a row, but only hits for 1. I might be wrong, since I've only just leapt back into Gwent, but... And Fog, I do believe, hits the strongest unit on a row, specifically. So they're still quite simple, still quite easy to understand as a mechanic within Gwent, but they're more unique, they're more sort of interesting, and yeah, they're actually initially much weaker, but over time they have this repeated kind of damage source effect, so over time they will kind of creep back up to how strong they were previously in closed beta. So weather decks probably will be weaker, but probably, since weather is more or less the only viable source of AoE in the game, outside of Lacerate and Big Scorches and Ignis, etc, etc, I do believe weather decks, weather control decks, will still be very much a thing. Especially since a lot of the monsters reworked weather cards seem quite powerful. So yeah, Gwent has definitely changed a massive degree, and I think most of the changes I do agree with. It's more accessible to new players. It's still complex, but let's face it, what new game and even a new CCG isn't when you first get into it. And yeah, they've also added, I should also mention, they've added and expanded upon the portrait system, so you can now select between, as well as Geralt, you can have the old Geralt 1 style, where he looks infinitely younger, hilariously, much less battle-scarred, and then you've got a bunch of the characters, you've got Triss, you've got Yennefer, etc, etc, Yorveth, you know, the list goes on, but it's cool just to have that kind of customization. And of course, before I left, they also added the emote system similar to Hearthstone, where you can click on your character's portrait in the bottom left, and up comes a dial, a rotational screen that allows you to pick between, you know, thanks, well played, good play, sorry, you know, mocking, all that kind of traditional, basically just BM stuff. And of course, you do have the option of just automatically muting everyone, so that's fantastic. But yeah, Gwent, super fun. If you're looking for a new game and want something quite laid back, but very sort of cognizant, I guess I would describe it. It feels like chess, at the very least, what I imagine chess to be. I don't play it all that often, but it's very much planning your moves in advance. It's sort of thinking the resource game, kind of balancing, can I pass this round and get a future advantage? Is that even worth it? And also in the background you've got all the traditional CCG things of building a deck, crafting it from scratch, if of course you're not just, you know, net decking, and yeah, trying to play as best you can. So it's a really cool game. Props to CD Projekt Red, as the changes they've made, I do believe, have overall improved this game. And it's super fun. Yeah, so this has been this week's episode of Weekly Spice. It's going to be a bit of an intermittent series, but hopefully, roughly every week, I will be playing something different. Occasionally doing maybe 2 episodes on a single game if the first Weekly Spice episode on a game was popular. But yeah. So as always guys, thank you for watching. Hopefully this was a nice recap and explanation of what Gwent is as a game, and I guess I will leave you with the last few minutes of this particular match. This is me with my Nilfgaard deck. Nilfgaard being a faction that focuses on using spy units that you throw on the opponent's board, giving them another unit to add to their strength total, but these units often have bonuses for you to harvest essentially from. And there's also additional synergies such as the Norska Brigade and etc, etc. So really cool faction, probably one of my favourites. And you're about to see one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made in Gwent. I thought that Weaken would kill the Iris on the opponent's board, and when Iris dies, she's one of my units, so when she dies, she buffs all of my units on my board by 3. So that's an example of a really powerful kind of spy traitor unit. Turns out that when you use Weaken, which is damage, it's actually not damage, it's reducing a unit's base strength, that Death Wish effect doesn't trigger. So I actually learnt something very powerful today. I did record that literally just a few seconds ago, so that was pretty embarrassing. But I included it because it was kind of hilarious at the time. I actually wish I'd been recording my live reaction, as I definitely was pissed off a little bit at that. But regardless, really cool game, and it's pretty fun. So if you want to check it out, it's completely available for you to download from the GOG store, I do believe, the good old game store. And that is, by the way, a really cool way to get old games that have been adapted to new operating systems. So, yeah, both of those things seem like a good idea if you haven't done so already. So, I will peace out right now and leave you with the rest of the match. So as always guys, thank you for watching. Hopefully I will see you in next week's Weekly Spice episode, or in my more concurrent videos, which are based on whatever game I'm currently playing. And yeah, see you in the next one. Ta-ta!
Aggroto dum anime est, spes est.
Did you insist?
Just great.